Mark walked into the boardroom for the biggest meeting of his life. But when he looked up, his heart stopped. Behind the desk sat Emily, the wife he had abandoned years ago when she was battling cancer. And now, she was his boss. Years earlier, Emily Johnson's life had shifted in a single doctor's visit. She sat in the sterile white office, gripping Mark's hand so tightly her knuckles turned pale. The doctor's words fell like stones. Stage 3 cancer. Aggressive. We need to begin treatment immediately. Emily glanced at her husband, searching for reassurance, for the man who had once sworn to love her in sickness and in health. At first, Mark nodded mechanically, his jaw clenched, his arms stiff around her shoulders. But the weeks that followed carved cracks into their marriage. The chemo sessions left Emily weak, nauseous, and frail. Her once shiny hair fell in clumps into the bathroom sink. She spent nights curled in pain while Mark stood in the hallway, scrolling through his phone, frustration etched on his face. One night, Emily whispered from the bed, her voice trembling, "Mark, will you stay with me tonight?" He sighed heavily. "I have work early, you know that." Tears pooled in her eyes as she watched him walk out of the room, leaving her alone with the silence. The bills stacked higher each month. Emily caught him staring at them like poison. He stopped driving her to treatments, making excuses about important meetings. She clung to hope, telling herself he was just scared. But deep down, fear curdled into dread. He was slipping away. The breaking point came on a rainy evening. Emily was hunched on the couch, a blanket around her frail frame, when Mark emerged from the bedroom with a suitcase. She stared at him, her voice barely a whisper. "Mark, what are you doing?" He didn't meet her eyes. "Emily, I can't do this anymore. I didn't sign up for this kind of life. I can't watch you waste away while everything else falls apart." Her breath caught, the words slicing deeper than any scalpel. "But you promise to love me in sickness and in health." Mark slammed the suitcase shut. "I'm sorry, I can't." And with that, he walked out the door, leaving her alone with her illness, her children, and the crushing weight of abandonment. Emily sat frozen, the sound of the rain pounding outside as her tears blended with the storm. That night, she whispered to herself in the darkness, "If he can't stand by me in my storm, then one day, he'll watch me shine without him." But Emily's story didn't end on that couch. What came next would turn her pain into power, and years later bring her face to face with the man who left her. The morning after Mark left, Emily woke to an empty bed and the weight of silence pressing on her chest. For a moment, she thought it had been a nightmare. Then she saw the folded note on the kitchen counter, 3 cold sentences about needing space and not being strong enough. She crumpled it in her fist and threw it away, vowing never to read it again. But life didn't pause. 2 children still needed breakfast. Bills still needed paying. And her next round of chemotherapy wasn't going to wait for her grief. Emily dragged herself to the hospital, shivering in the thin gown as poison dripped into her veins, determined not to let despair finish what cancer had started. Her children became her anchor. On days she thought she couldn't lift her head, her daughter would bring her a glass of water, whispering, "Mom, you're my hero." Her son would sit by her side with his homework, pretending not to notice when she wiped tears from her cheeks. They gave her reason to endure the nausea, the weakness, the loneliness of a bed half empty. The months blurred into a cycle of treatment and exhaustion. She lost her hair, her strength, her savings. But she never lost her will. On her darkest nights, when fear whispered that she would never live to see her children grow up, she repeated the same words to herself. "One day, I will walk out of this storm." And then, after years of struggle, that day came. Emily stood in the oncology ward, surrounded by nurses and patients, as the bell was placed in her hand. Her arms trembled as she rang it, the sound echoing through the hall. Applause broke out, but Emily's tears weren't just from relief. They were from the knowledge that she had survived alone. She looked at her children, their eyes shining with pride, and whispered, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." Emily's fight against cancer was over, but her fight to rebuild her life was just beginning. What she did next would transform her from a patient into a powerhouse. Life after remission was far from easy. Emily emerged from the hospital with scars on her body, debt in her mailbox, and a gap in her resume that seemed impossible to fill. But she also carried something more powerful than fear: resolve. At night, when her children were asleep, She opened her old textbooks. She pushed through exhaustion, studying business and finance by the glow of a desk lamp. She applied for jobs no one thought she would get. And when she was turned away, she applied again the next morning. Rejection fueled her fire instead of extinguishing it. She took an entry-level position at a small logistics firm. The hours were long, and the pay was barely enough to cover rent and groceries. But she attacked every assignment with a hunger her colleagues couldn't match. When her manager struggled with reports, Emily stayed late to fix them. When clients threatened to leave, she calmed them with patience and precision. Slowly, doors began to open. A supervisor noticed her work ethic. A director offered mentorship. Within a few years, she was no longer the frail, patient people remembered. She was the woman executives trusted to solve problems no one else could. Her children grew alongside her career, watching as she climbed rung after rung. She often reminded them, "We don't wait for miracles, we build them." By her early 40s, Emily had done the impossible. She moved from manager to director, then from director to board member. The same resilience that kept her alive in hospital wards now drove her in boardrooms. Every time she stood at a podium to present, she remembered lying weak in that hospital bed and smiled at how far she'd come. And then came the call from Glasswell Corporation, a Fortune 500 company. Battered by scandal and desperate for a leader who could rebuild trust, Emily didn't hesitate. The board voted unanimously. Emily Johnson would be their new CEO. What Emily didn't know was that fate was already setting the stage. The man who had abandoned her years ago was about to sit across the table from her, begging for a chance at survival of his own. Mark adjusted his tie, his palms damp. For weeks he had clung to this moment as his last chance. His career was crumbling, his debts mounting, and this company's revival might mean his own survival. Mark walked into the boardroom, his briefcase heavy in his hand. He had spent the night rehearsing what he would say, telling himself this meeting could be the turning point of his career. But the moment he looked up, his breath caught in his throat. Sitting at the head of the long mahogany table was Emily. Her posture was straight, her suit sharp, her presence commanding. She didn't look like the frail woman he had abandoned years ago, hollowed out by illness. She looked like power itself. Mark froze mid-step, his legs refusing to move. His colleagues kept chatting around the table, oblivious to the storm raging inside him. For them, she was the new CEO. For him, she was the wife he had left to face cancer alone. Emily's eyes lifted briefly from the papers in front of her. Their gazes met for the first time in years. No smile, no recognition. Just a cool professional nod before she addressed the room. "Good morning. Let's begin." Mark sat down slowly, forcing his hands to stop trembling as he opened his notepad. His colleagues leaned forward, eager to hear from the new CEO, but Mark could barely breathe. He couldn't stop staring at her. Emily, the woman he had once sworn to love, protect, and cherish, until he walked out on her in the middle of her darkest fight. Emily clicked her pen and began outlining the company's turnaround strategy. Her tone was clear, decisive. She spoke of restructuring teams, cutting waste, and building trust with clients again. Around the table, heads nodded. People scribbled notes. No one noticed the man 2 seats away gripping his pen so tightly it nearly snapped. Mark tried to focus on the numbers, on the charts projected behind her. But his mind replayed that rainy night, the suitcase in his hand, her frail voice whispering, "Please don't leave me." He had shut the door on her then. Now, she was shutting doors he desperately needed open. Halfway through the meeting, Emily's eyes swept the room and landed on him. "Mr. Johnson," she said evenly, "I'll expect your department's report on my desk by Friday. No delays." The sound of his own name jolted him. His mouth went dry. "Yes, of course," he stammered. A few colleagues glanced his way, surprised at his shaky tone. Emily didn't linger. She simply turned to the next executive, her expression unreadable. Mark scribbled nonsense on his notepad, trying to mask the flush rising in his cheeks. He couldn't tell if she remembered, if she cared, or if he was nothing more than another name on her list. But deep inside, panic clawed at him. Because if Emily did remember, if she still carried the wounds of his betrayal, then his career, his future, maybe even his dignity, were already lost. Mark thought the humiliation would end with the meeting, but he was wrong. Emily had only just begun to show him what it meant to be powerless. The days that followed were a blur of pressure for Mark. Every morning, he walked into the building with his head down, praying he could avoid Emily's gaze. But she never let him blend into the background. At team briefings, her eyes would find him. "Mr. Johnson, where is that analysis?" His voice always cracked as he answered. At strategy sessions, she would ask pointed questions about his work. Each one was a blade, sharp and deliberate, leaving him scrambling to respond while his colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. He began to dread the sound of her heels clicking down the hallway. Once he overheard two junior staff whisper, "The new CEO's incredible, isn't she? So confident, so fierce." Mark slipped into his office, shutting the door before they could see the shame burning on his face. At night, he sat at his kitchen table, staring at the bills piling up. His second marriage had collapsed years ago. His children from that union barely spoke to him. And now, the one woman who had every reason to hate him was the only person standing between him and professional ruin. One evening, after a particularly brutal presentation, where Emily dismantled his prepared slides in front of the entire board, Mark waited until the others had left. His palms were sweating, his throat tight, but he knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. He walked toward her office door, hesitated, then knocked softly. "Come in," her voice called from inside. Mark stepped in, closing the door behind him. Emily was seated at her desk, reviewing a stack of files. She didn't look up. "Yes, Mr. Johnson?" His knees felt weak. This was the moment he had been dreading, and the one he thought might save him. What Mark said next wasn't part of any report or presentation. It was a desperate plea to the woman he had once abandoned, and Emily. His response would cut deeper than any rejection he'd ever faced. "Emily, please," he stammered, stepping closer. "I know I don't deserve it, but I have to say this. I was wrong. I was a coward. When you needed me most, I left. And I've hated myself every day since. Please, give me a second chance. I need this job. I need you to understand, I wasn't thinking clearly back then." Emily's pen stilled. Slowly, she lifted her eyes. They weren't the tear-filled eyes of the woman he had abandoned. They were sharp, steady, and utterly unshaken. "You weren't thinking clearly?" she repeated, her voice low. "Mark, I was bald, sick, and terrified, clinging to life while raising 2 children alone." "And you weren't thinking clearly?" "No, you were thinking about yourself, and that's all you've ever thought about." He flinched, but pressed on, desperation cracking his voice. "I know I failed you, but people change. I've lost everything since then. My marriage, my family, my dignity. Please, don't let me lose this too. I'll do anything. Just don't shut me out." Emily rose from her chair, her heels clicking softly against the floor as she came around the desk. She stopped a breath away from him, her presence commanding. "You want mercy?" she said evenly. "When I begged for mercy, when I begged you to stay, you walked out with your suitcase. You taught me then that mercy doesn't come from others. It comes from surviving on your own. And I did." Mark's eyes brimmed with tears. "So this is it? You're going to destroy me?" Her expression hardened into something final. "No, Mark. I don't need to destroy you. You already did that to yourself. All I need to do is move on." She turned, sat back at her desk, and without another glance, pressed the intercom. "Please show Mr. Johnson out." Mark's chest caved as he stumbled to the door. He looked back one last time, but Emily's eyes were already on her papers. To her, he was nothing more than the past, dead weight she had long since outgrown. That evening, Emily drove home through the city's glowing streets, the confrontation still echoing faintly in her mind. But as she opened the door to her apartment, all the weight of the past fell away. Her children were waiting, now grown into young adults who had stood by her side through every storm. The kitchen was warm with the smell of dinner, their laughter spilling into the hallway. "Mom, how was your first week as CEO?" her son asked, pulling out a chair for her. Emily smiled, settling at the table. "Challenging," she said softly, "but rewarding." Her daughter leaned forward, studying her. "Are you happy?" For a moment, Emily thought of the boardroom, of Mark's desperate eyes, of the man who once left her to fight alone. She thought of how he had begged, and how she had no need to punish him, because his regret was punishment enough. She looked at her children, the very reason she had fought through: sickness, poverty, and loneliness, and her heart swelled with pride. "Yes," she said firmly, "I'm happy. Because true strength isn't about who stays when times are easy. It's about who refuses to leave when life tests you. Her children smiled, and for the first time in years, Emily felt utterly free. The woman once abandoned on a rainy night had not only survived, she had risen higher than anyone ever imagined. And the man who left her? He would spend the rest of his life remembering the day he discovered the wife he discarded had become his boss. Emily's story is a reminder: betrayal may wound us, but it cannot define us. The greatest revenge isn't revenge at all. It's living so fully, so powerfully, that those who left you can only watch from the shadows of their own regret. So what do you think? Did Emily do the right thing by refusing to help Mark, or should she have given him another chance? If you were in her place, what would you have done? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. We'll see you again in the next story.